Hi, my name is Lisa Campbell. I'm director of the Barry Center for the Arts at Ramapo College of New Jersey. We're delighted that you're here with us this evening for our question and answer session with filmmaker Neel Scott. If you have a question you'd like to ask my guest, please put your question into the Q&A function of your Zoom and not the chat function. Go ahead and list your question into the Q&A function. And we're going to get started. So Neel, one of the great things about the kind of film you make is that obviously you've got to develop a storyline here. Could you tell us a little bit about where did you get the idea for this storyline and what did you want audiences to take away from Blue Hole?
Sure, and thanks for having me. Originally, the story came in sort of a roundabout way. I've always been interested in the outdoors. I do a lot of hiking and that sort of thing. And I was on a message board a while back, and one of the topics was crashed airplanes in the Adirondacks and the Hudson Valley, Catskills, and so on. That immediately piqued my interest. I had no idea that there were still crashed airplanes in the woods or in the wilderness, whatever, up there. These are all, the reason why they're still there is because they're generally very remote. There are no roads that go to them. There are no trails that go to them. So I started trying to visit a couple of them, and you just go through GPS coordinates and find them in the woods if you know how to do that. And so there was one that I got to that was, some of them were much less kind of manageable. They were 5 or 6 hours hike in, 5 or 6 hours hike out, and quite a sort of journey. But there was one that was around 2 hours hike in, which seemed like it might be manageable, although sort of still fairly crazy for a film production. But I didn't really have the idea for the film production itself until I got there and I was with some friends, and we all sort of had this realization at the time that we were sort of all participating in that, oh, this is this really cool thing where, wow, we've gotten to this crashed airplane in the woods. And then, it's also sort of dawned on us as well that this was a site where people died. 3 people died in the plane crash that's in this film. And and that was sort of a very sobering moment as well. And so there was this duality to it that I found, I guess, evocative and somewhat profound, that this was this sort of mystery that I felt like we had sort of uncovered, obviously, in the same way some of the kids had uncovered it in the film. But then there was also this sort of tragedy that went along with it. So that was sort of the genesis of the story initially. And then kind of, drawing out from there, trying to begin to think about, oh, that might be a good film, but how can I develop it? What might it look like? And usually I sort of write from characters. So I began to think of characters that I thought, might live in sort of whatever this area is, largely rural area, and who they might be, what they've experienced. And obviously, some of the characters, or at least one of the character, I felt like had to have experienced some sort of loss in order to connect with this in a really profound way that others might not connect with it. So that was the initial genesis of the story. And then obviously there are a lot of refinements. I think the script was in, various stages. I mean, there are probably, 20 drafts. It took probably about a year to write it from the initial conception and outline to the finished shooting script and so on. So that was the genesis and sort of the writing of the story. In terms of, and I hope this doesn't come off as too much of a cop-out answer, but, maybe other questions will touch on this as well. But in terms of what people take away from it, I generally try and I'm usually not writing for or directing for a message at the end of the day per se. That I want people to, I want sometimes my films can be a little bit oblique, might be one word, and I want people to be able to approach it from different angles and take away something that's perhaps meaningful to them if they can. But I don't think there's any prescription that I want to put on it in terms of how people view the film or the explicit message. I mean, I think there are messages in there. They're messages for me at least, or they're themes that I was putting in. But I want I hope that it's open enough and that there are enough sort of angles to approach it that people can take away different things from it at the end of the day.
That's great. I think that they do. It does. The film does have a mysterious feel to it, and I like the idea that there's some interpretation left for the audience. There are segments of the film where the actors communicate in a very nonverbal way, and I just was curious as a writer if you talk to us about that choice a little bit. If is that a conscious choice and what you're trying to convey that way?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a little bit of a conscious choice. Some of this may relate back to my classes here at Ramapo, what I teach students and so on. And it's a bit of a cliche, but, we talk about that the number one rule of dialogue is when you don't have to write dialogue, don't write dialogue. And I think a lot of times dialogue is one of the things that's really fun to write, and you sit down and you have a scene and all of a sudden it's 8 pages long and it's way too long and you need to scale it back, and ultimately it's the dialogue has sort of escaped the film to some degree, if that makes sense. So I'm always really conscious of that and of the idea of paring down dialogue, that film should be edited dialogue. But beyond that, I'm really interested in the nonverbal and what's communicated that way. Sort of the way a lot of times I think about it is that and sometimes I think about a film this way, is you enter a room or you enter a party, and let's say it's a party where just as a metaphor, you don't know one person and that person is not there. So you're going in and you're introducing yourselves to people and you're making small talk and you're trying to figure out who people are. And so much of the interaction, if you think about that, if you put yourself in those shoes, is sort of nonverbal, and you're reading between the lines and you're trying to find out what's going on. And a lot of it is done by, whether it's facial expressions or body language or what have you. So I'm really interested in that. And, and then also just as film is a visual medium and the face is sort of the ultimate communicator of that. And so, one of the things I always look for in actors, and, obviously I think any actors have to have this unless there's a role that doesn't require this, but is a high degree of expressivity, that they're really able to communicate with their eyes and communicate with their face and so on. So I'm interested in I guess, another way of saying that is in the quiet parts of life too, and in the things that are, communicated that other people might not pick up on, but hopefully, I'm helping to, if I am doing this, guide people through those moments and to see that there. So
that's great. You have these two couples, and I was wondering if you could describe the relationship between the couples prior to the discovery of the plane wreck as opposed to after that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So there are two couples. There's you don't know, you only know two of their names throughout this, and that's all the characters had names, but the point was not to I wanted the characters to function in sort of iconic is the wrong word, but I wanted them to just to sort of exist as characters without necessarily having a name to them. So I'm gonna a long way of saying that I'm going to give them sort of shorthand here. So there's the couple with the lead young woman, and then the guy with the long hair, and then there's the other couple with the guy with the beard and the taller woman of the two. And so, one of the questions sometimes on this is, exactly what is the relationship, especially with the long-haired guy, Anders is his name, and, his partner, and, or are they boyfriend-girlfriend? Are they just friends? And I'm open, in my mind, they're boyfriend-girlfriend, but I was less interested in sort of the romantic aspect of it than in the friendship aspect of it. And the others are a couple as well, the other two. But, the way I sort of saw it is, and this is you write what you know to some degree, is the male friendships as sort of this the bond, this kind of the central bond that sort of the narrative hangs on to some degree, and how that's tested by the discovery to some degree. And so for me, with them, that there is both of them both the two men are sort of in it. They're going towards the same goal, which is, they're stuck at home. They live in perhaps what we could say is sort of a dead end town. They're not sure where they're going to go, and this is their ticket to fame. While one has reservations about, sort of the trauma that's happened to his girlfriend. And, this obviously splits the two of them, and then perhaps they come back together a little bit at the end. But the plane crash is what, in a sense, brings what is the elephant in the room, which is the trauma and we can talk more about that and what I will say about that or what I won't say about the trauma that's happened to the young woman in the past, brings that to the fore. And then, given that, how are they able to manage this? What is their emotional relationship become? And, the way I sort of see it is with, you have four characters and you have allegiances that are shifting. The taller woman, Lucy, she's mad at her boyfriend at one point in time. So there, it's all sort of shifting around, and obviously, hopefully evoked by this, the discovery of this crashed airplane.
I wondered if you would tell us what the title means.
Okay, so I think like a lot of other filmmakers, and I know there's some in the audience as well, the title can be the hardest thing to come up with, and this was both sort of the easiest and hardest thing. So, the other part about finding location, the plane crash initially, is that one of the things that I discovered and that I obviously wrote into the story was near the parking lot for where you hiked into the plane crash, there was a swimming hole that I didn't know about that was one of the top 10 swimming holes in the United States. At that time, it's very overrun now, but at that time it was very quiet and what have you. And there, it was called Blue Hole. I felt that was always the working title, and I couldn't find anything better than that. And I felt, one of the things that I was interested in the film is writing a film about grief to some degree, and writing a film about mourning, but not, there are no pictures of, the people who were lost. It's not even exactly specified, obviously, what happened or who was lost, but we know that there was some sort of profound loss. And a lot of times in films about grieving and so on, you encounter a lot of looking at pictures and talking about the people who were lost. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I feel like that's certainly a trope in films. And I was more interested in the idea of absence. And I think that sort of speaks, the various parts of the film hopefully speak to that. But this idea of, essentially when a person is gone, there is a hole left in your life, and you're the rest of the time, the rest of your life, you're trying to sort of, manage that. How do you live with this, lacuna, this absence that never fully goes away? So, obviously the word, the term spoke to that. Blue, obviously, is something that has historically had, references to melancholy and so on. So I didn't think of the title. The title came to me, and I couldn't figure out anything better. So that's the story, I guess.
Well, I did good, because that's kind of I interpreted it as having double meaning along those lines. So that's good. I know that you used professional actors, and I'm curious if you could tell us about the casting process and how you went about casting the film, and also, how do you know when you have the right actors for a film?
Sure. So with the casting process, it was, I want to say, 4 to 6 months, something along those lines. So I worked with a casting director in New York City. So there are a couple of casting resources. There's one thing called Backstage, which is sort of the main kind of actors listing where a lot of people post things. I've used that since, and I've used it in the past. But one of the things, especially if you're writing characters who are in their mid-20s, you can get slammed with hundreds of submissions, and it's really difficult to sort that out. So I wanted to work with a casting director, and also someone who had people sort of access to, a lot of times backstage actors, there's nothing wrong with this, but they're early stages of their career. So I worked with him sort of, looking at actors who were, sort of at the mid stage of their career, doing well. Obviously, they're all very young in this. And basically, we saw, I think, for the 4 roles, and it was great because it was very discreet. There weren't 10 roles that we were trying to figure out. And, all roles were sort of, in my mind, at least equally important. And to me, they were fairly distinct as well. So we saw, I think, probably at the end of the day, around 50 people for each role. So around 200 people total. And I think there were probably 6 rounds of auditions, something like that. So, I narrowed people down, or we narrowed people down. We brought people back again, and then we would start pairing off actors to sort of see. Obviously, the couple dynamic is really important in this, and also the male friendship dynamic as well. So we were really trying to, find out who worked, there, and where the chemistry was, and so on. So it was a really long process. I mean, it's something I love casting, because it's you have this thing that's been on the page for so long, in this case, a year, and then all of a sudden you're seeing these faces come in, and, it's just exciting. Every actor will bring something, even if they're not right for the role, they bring something new and perhaps shed some light on the, on your film itself. In terms of knowing when you have the right actor, I mean, I think almost any filmmaker would say that that's just some weird gut instinct. So some of the actors that are in this, that came in, and within 30 seconds, I knew they were right for the role. And that's something that you hear a lot, right? Just the way, actors are told, and, hopefully they, either this is, sort of instinctual, or they keep this in mind that, as soon as you walk into the room, you are auditioning for the film, that's, how you carry yourself, the clothes that you're wearing, what have you. So there were 2 people in particular in here that I immediately knew were right for the role, and I wanted to keep bringing them back. I didn't want to just sort of say, oh, you're right for the role, and I know that. I wanted to, reinforce that at every round. The others, it was just a process of sort of winnowing down, and ultimately sort of going with your gut and what you feel like works best. And, and you're always looking for people who have a presence and have I think, especially at this level, I think once actors get into later stages of their career, they may have more of a range. But right now, I think you're generally, for actors who are generally in their 20s, you're looking for someone who has sort of a personal and I guess personality identification with the character to some degree. At least that's what so I would, when somebody would come in, it would be generally longer. So they would come in for 20 minutes or 25 minutes, and we would talk about, where are you from? What do you enjoy? How would you describe yourselves? When they had seen the role, how would you relate to this character? That sort of thing. So really trying to, that's one of the biggest parts, of your work as a director, if not the biggest part, is really sort of getting in with your actors and developing sort of a common language and a way to help them navigate the roles. And, so that was a really essential part in this long process, but one that I was ultimately really happy with, not everyone was exactly how I saw the roles when I wrote them, but that was also the real great part about casting, is you would see something new when people came in that you hadn't necessarily brought in. That might, there were still rewrites that were going on, up until a week before shooting, minor tweaks and that sort of thing. And that might be, oh, she said something in this rehearsal that, oh, I liked how she said that. I liked how she phrased that, and so on. So that was all part of it.
That's great. That's great. You've worked, I know, extensively both as a director, you've written and directed, as well as an editor. And I thought it might be interesting for you to tell us sort of help us understand the difference between the two, and specifically how that impacts the outcome of what the film turns out to look like.
Sure. I guess in part it depends on obviously the project, and if how commercial the project is, and sort of your role as you come in. I mean, historically as a director, I've been sort of involved throughout the process. So generally, I've directed what I've written. For the most part, sometimes people come on as directors for hire. I've edited what I've directed and written, and sometimes you'll have an editor for that. And I guess that's sort of adjacent to the second part of the question, or the second sort of role. But for me, I mean, being a director is always about being the quote unquote filmmaker, and so that all of the decisions that, at least so far in my career, have been mine once I make them. And this sort of, for better or worse, and I think there's an argument sometimes that it's worse, but hopefully in my case, it's been for the better, that there's sort of a complete vision that you have of the film, and that, hopefully that you're able to realize. And that I think sometimes that there's a importance to having a unity of vision, if you feel like you have sort of a technical mastery and a conceptual mastery of all the aspects of the filmmaking, sound design and editing, not to say that I'm some sort of master of these things, you're always learning and so on, but you feel like you have a connection and a reason to be working on those parts of the project in a way that's not hubristic or what have you, I think there's a strength to that. I think there's also conversely a strength if you're a director to having, other eyes come in as well. So I haven't yet directed a feature. There have been a couple that have been sort of in the pipeline for a while in various stages of development. For that, I would bring in an editor. I think something like that is too unwieldy. I think any filmmaker will tell you that there's a certain point in the process where you lose perspective on the greater whole. And I think on a short, that's more manageable, which is mainly the form that I've worked in so far, so that's more manageable. But a feature, I think that's more difficult. But on the editing question, so it kind of depends on the project. A lot of the stuff that I've worked on in the past has been more commercial. So a lot of times you come in and depending, especially sort of, if it's a very commercial work, there are, pretty specific set of guidelines. And a lot of times if they're storyboards, let's say it's a TV commercial or something like that, almost exactly how it's going to end up. There might be a little bit of change there, but there's also a great power to the editor, especially when you're working on things that are less prescribed. I often find a lot of times I've done less work on that to some degree, but on documentaries, just because of the many different ways that you can approach it. But there's another sort of well-worn phrase in filmmaking is that the final edit is the final draft of the script to some degree, and there's a reason why directors fight for what's called final cut, right? The idea that, directors oftentimes lose that. Only a few directors in Hollywood, Quentin Tarantino, Martin Scorsese, Paul Thomas Anderson, what have you, have final cut because, a lot of times historically directors have wanted that and gotten that, and then their films become unwieldy. The studios want to take that away from them. So there's a huge power in the editing, there are literally in any film within 2 minutes of editing the film, you've already encountered an infinite number of possibilities of ways that you could edit those scenes. So there's a huge power in that, and but at the same time, it just sort of depends on the project. Some projects are very prescribed. Some projects are you're working closely with the director, and they already have a pretty specific vision of the film, so you're trying to show them just some alternate things. You're giving them a guideline. Sometimes they're even sitting there with you for 10 hours a day in the editing room or what have you. And sometimes you have complete freedom. I'll see you in a week and show me what you have, or upload it for me, or what have you. But there's a power in both, and certainly I think sometimes people outside of film see editing and the editor role as prominent, but in a number of films you could argue that the editor role is equally, if not more, important to the success of the film than perhaps even the directing role, or the director's role.
That's great. Thank you for that understanding of that process. I'm going to invite my colleague, Ed Eloy, to come in and bring some of the questions that we're getting from our audience. And while Edward joins us, I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about how the film was shot in a technical sense, because I know we always have students and people here that understand film and they want to know that.
Okay, so it was, so it's obviously an all outdoor shoot, and it was a 6-day shoot, and we had the best weather of the summer that week, which was an absolute relief, because one day of rain and all of a sudden you get behind and you've reserved the motel for 7 nights or whatever else it is. But that's sort of also a way of getting to the fact that there were no lights in this film at all. So we were working with sort of what's called negative fill and diffusion and so on. And my DP on the film did a fantastic job of still giving it quite a sort of refined, to a degree, refined look through that. But perhaps even more important than that, so this is something that most of our students, and I know again some of them are on this, will unfortunately never do, and this is something that I may never do again, and that could be a good or a bad thing. But so this was shot on film, and specifically 35mm film, so the same gauge film that you would have seen in theaters 10 or 15 years ago, almost everything shot on. And that was a decision made because I like the look of the film, and hopefully that you can see in a sense that there's this sort of wet look and almost kind of a mysterious look that you get from film that you just can't, people trying to emulate that look, and people are getting very close with digital technology these days. But at the same time, film is still the celluloid process, the photochemical process has never been replicated yet. And so we were really conscious of wanting to get that, but with that comes a huge expense. And I don't remember the exact number, but I don't even really want to think about it. I calculated out the amount to the second for every film that we were shooting, because you bought the film and you pay for the film and you pay for the development of the film and a number of other processes. So there was sort of at times sort of a heart attack waiting to happen with the shooting on film. But at the same time, the one thing I will say to that, though, is that one of the things that I think shooting on film benefits from is the sort of level of sort of attention that needs to be brought to it. So because there's this cost with everything, I think this permeates to the actors, this permeates to the crew, that there's sort of a need to be on your toes at all times. Actors have to know their lines. Camera people have to make sure that on that rack focus or that follow focus that they're nailing it the first time, because time, in this sense, to use the sort of hackney phrase, is money, and is quite a bit of money. So, we were at times shooting only one take of things, which, the other aspect of shooting on film is that you don't know what you get until you send it to the lab. So that, if that take had been, and this is where you trust your DP, if that take had been, ruined, or if there had been a problem, it would have been potentially disastrous. We didn't have that happen. But, ultimately we had our shooting ratio for this film was, I think, like 3.5 to 1, which means for every 3.5 minutes we shot, there was a minute of that in the film. So it's a 19-minute film. So, bring that out, it's, 75 minutes or 72 minutes or something like that. Most films that are shot on a digital format, which is 99.9% of them, have a shooting ratio of at least 20 to 1, something like that. So there's so much more, so that's both a good and a bad thing, right? You have all of this room to, work on performance. Oh, let's roll that again. Let's go from here because we're shooting digitally, because literally this is costing us no money. Whereas on film, the costs become quickly immense. So there was I think that's the main answer to your question. And there's, benefits and drawbacks. I'm really glad I did it. It was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life in terms of just, a week later getting the film from the lab and doing our first dailies and seeing what we had. But I was really happy with it, and I think it does. If any of the filmmakers on here ever are going to shoot on film or shoot on film again, it does really bring something to the table in terms of how a film set works. It really forces a certain efficiency that can be good for filmmaking.
That's great. So Ed, what does our audience want to hear?
Well, hello everyone. I would like to encourage you to continue to pose your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. Actually, the last question that you asked, Neel answered approximately 3 other questions in the Q&A box. So what I will do, rather than starting with the first question, I will jump around just to make sure I can get a bit. Peter asked, and he thanked you for sharing this beautiful film. He says, can you talk about the complications of shooting outdoors, especially on locations far away from resources? And did you shoot this all in one day, or was it over time? You partially answered that, but please go ahead.
Sure. So it was a 6-day shoot, and it was obviously broken up by location. So we had one day at the plane site, one day at the blue hole, the swimming hole site, and so on. No, it brought in enormous complications in terms of shooting this. Even something, even though we didn't have lights, we still have all of this big equipment for working with negative fill and diffusing, and we had a whole truck full of equipment basically. So even at a place like the blue hole, which is there's a parking area up the road, it's still loading and unloading is about an hour and a half, something like that. Just that process to do that. So that's all factored in. The biggest challenge was shooting at the plane site, obviously, and that was a 2-hour hike in with our camera guy. The camera probably weighed 50 pounds. I thought I was really actually worried about him, one of the ACs who was carrying it in. We had to carry in water and food for the day and all these other things. And so that was, I was extremely nervous beforehand. And actually, I didn't want to be part of guiding this, so we actually hired a guide, a local hiking guy who I'd interacted with to get us in. So there's just the logistical sort of issues or something like that are particularly overwhelming, especially shooting at most of which were pretty remote locations. And the second thing on that is the idea of controlling light. So I didn't want this to have some sort of perfect feel to it. I wanted it to be, to be a little bit rough around the edges, but at the same time, you're shooting outdoors. There's can be a huge dynamic range in the lights, in the amount of lighting there is, and you're constantly controlling for that. And a cloud goes over and the lights change, and you have to reset things and so on. So you inherently give up a degree of control when you're shooting an environment like that you just have to accept. And additionally, you also you just have to work your way around. So there's a lot more thinking on your feet. And we had a fairly small crew as these things go. I think there were probably 13, 14 of us. So that may sound big, but that's actually, in the grand scheme of things, small. And just everyone was doing, a little bit of everything. And it was a fantastic film shoot because everyone bought into it, which is not always the case. Everyone, both by the fact I think people enjoy being outdoors and being in some, really nice locations, but also there was just sort of a camaraderie to it that made things that if people weren't as into it, would have made them much more difficult. So a roundabout way of answering Peter's question, but hopefully it did.
Okay. My next question, since you talked about course, actually includes two. I'm joining 2 questions together. The first part is from Stanley. If I may, who funded this wonderful film? And the second part of the question is from Colin. What was your budget and how did you attend said budget?
Mm-hmm. Okay, both good questions, of which I'm going to be somewhat opaque about, at least the second part of it. So this was funded as most short films are. So I didn't do a GoFundMe or anything for this. So it was family, friends, and savings. So this represented a couple of years of eating ramen noodles and that sort of thing, and saving up, and then family and friends who believed in it. I promised to pay them back someday if I could, or some of the money that the film made would go towards them. And there was a small grant as well that went towards a relatively small grant, although it was quite helpful. It paid for our lodging expenses for the week, although that wasn't necessarily what the grant was earmarked for, but it could go towards anything. And in terms of the budget, I will say it was. What's the best way of phrasing this? It was above five figures. It was not six figures, but it was above five figures. And that was a decision we made. It could have been a lot cheaper if we hadn't shot on film. The film cost was probably 40% of the budget, at least, something like that. So, but that was, I felt like I had earned that through the through my dietary restrictions for the previous couple of years. So.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Colin. How old were you when you directed this? But I like to change that question by saying, how many years ago did you direct this film? And you could choose to answer it either way.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe I'll do it in a way that doesn't reveal my age, but I was I was 33 when without doing the math, I was 33 when I directed this.
Okay. From Jennifer, can you tell us about the sound design? For example, why did you choose to bookend the film with score and not score anywhere else?
Yeah, so that piece, it's a song by a band called Growing, who aren't around anymore, unfortunately, but a band I like quite a bit, and was acquaintances or friends with one of the members in the band. And I'd always thought that I wanted to use that for something, and there was sort of a undefinable quality about it. I'm less interested in the score that is happy or sad or eerie or what have you. And I felt like it got to sort of perhaps something that I was going for with the film, and it felt appropriate to open and close it as a way of sort of bringing us in and out of this world to some degree. But I'm less interested in general in score in films, at least for my own work at this point in time, and I was obviously then as well. And just something, I think score can be really it can be, profound, it can be appropriate and so on. But at the same time, I think a lot of times score does some heavy lifting dramatically, and that there's sort of a reliance on the score. And I felt in a way it would be, I won't lie, there were times when I sort of tried score on parts when I felt like scenes weren't working as well as they could. And it felt almost sort of an intrusion on that world to some degree, that this world was sort of all about the woods and quiet. And, the way that I could do score was by manipulating the sounds in the woods, and what are different tones of wind, that you can bring in, how do sounds change in level and so on. So, I think at the end of the day, I like that score because in a way it's very subtle, and it gets to it's sort of indescribable in terms of the emotion it's going for. And in terms of in terms of score itself, I have mixed feelings about it, and just didn't feel ultimately it was appropriate for the rest of this film, that I wanted it to live and die by what was going on the screen, for better or worse, perhaps.
Okay. Next question is from Ricky. What was supposed to be on the paper that the characters shared at the site?
Okay, so this is the question I get, and sometimes, and I will say that I completely understand the impulse. Sometimes people are sort of annoyed. So this was a big discussion in the editing of the film. So there is a news article that we mocked up, and it was on that piece of paper, and that explained it, and lots of showing cuts to friends, and and basically the question came down to, so I felt like, if you look at this film, hopefully it could have happened at any point in the last, there's no cell phone, so maybe, that gives something away, but could have happened at any point in the last 40 years. The clothes don't give something too much away. The style doesn't give too much away, that sort of thing. And I wanted it to be sort of universal. And so there was a lot of discussion about two things. Number one was, do we reveal what happened to the young woman, to the lead? And do we show that paper? And I was always adamant, I'm not going to reveal what happened to her. I want this to be a projection. Everyone has experienced grief, that they can perhaps put their own grief onto that moment. That's a way of identifying with the character. And then I felt ultimately it sort of wasn't important. I didn't, and that was a big debate. Other people believe differently. Other people, some friends, who I showed it to, believe the same as I did. But ultimately the decision was that, that we didn't need to see that. So that it, that in line with the universality of the film, that all we needed to know that there was a plane crash, the woman died, and that we could leave it at that, that would be bringing in other details from sort of the outside world, where I wanted this to be almost this sort of snow globe, these 4 people in the woods, and there was no sort of, for this film, at least, there's nothing more than that. There's no parents, there's no, there's no restaurant that they go to. There's the one part that still kills me. I watched this, obviously, just to make sure it was okay before the screening went up. There was, there's a car that goes by on a road in the background, and that kills me every time I watch it, because we had no other shot where there was a car that didn't go by, because, and this is maybe a roundabout way of answering it, but that ruined sort of the universality of it, this hermetic world that I really wanted to have there. So a long way of saying there were details. There was a newspaper article about the plane crash, but that's all I'll reveal there. And I realize that can be frustrating, and I'm not doing it to be coy, but just because of sort of a belief in what to reveal about the narrative here.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Jono. This film felt very European, French to me, and the cinematography and dialogue were there. Were there any films that were major influences on the creation of this film?
I would say, there were a couple of filmmakers that I was watching a lot at the time when I made this, and they're definitely influences. I'm sort of a big believer that you can never transcend your influences. If you're a filmmaker, then you're inherently watching or you should be watching lots of films, and that these things, inherently sort of seep into you. But the 2 major influences were a French filmmaker named Robert Bresson, who he's hard to. So Jono, you were correct on that. Actually, you're correct on both of them. He's a filmmaker who it's really hard to sort of describe his style. So if you haven't seen his films, Pickpocket, A Man Escaped, highly recommend those if people haven't seen them. But he was very interested in sort of in the face, and in sort of, he takes it much further than I would, or I did, but a certain sort of expressiveness through non-expressiveness, which is not going to make sense here, but if you watch his films, it completely will. But it's sort of stripping things down, and he's also certainly interested in kind of minimal dialogue and pulling things back and so on. And he's interested in hands. He loves hands, loves faces. And the other one was this French filmmaker named Claire Denis, who I'm a huge fan of the majority of her films. And especially there were a couple of films that came out before this, one named Beau Travail and another one named The Intruder, that were both very influential films to me and my peers, my friends, and other filmmakers. I remember seeing an interview with Barry Jenkins not too long ago, the director of Moonlight, and he was talking about, which I think is, we were all, we were sort of the same class in film school, all coming up at the same time, and most of the people who I know who are, operating sort of the same idiom or genre, we were all influenced by Claire Denis. She was just sort of a giant to us to some degree, and sort of the impressionistic nature in which she approached filmmaking, and sort of her unique view of the way, it's dancing about architecture sort of thing. I'll let you watch her films, and then you can take from it what you will. So.
Yolanda, can you talk about the vintage footage used at the beginning and at the end of the film?
Mm-hmm. So I felt like it was important. So there was no footage of the people who were in this plane, but I felt like both, as a way of sort of doing justice to maybe my use of the footage, or my use of the plane, which at times I felt a sort of moral issue around it, or I don't think ultimately, at least in my mind, it was problematic, but at the same time, I wanted to sort of do justice and sort of giving a face to this person who died, whatever that face might be, just as the idea that there was a human behind this plane. So this was a woman named Kay Stinson, who was not Amelia Earhart, and that's the sometimes the reference that's there. But she did not crash. I think she lived a long and happy life, but she was one of the first female pilots flying in this area, flying mail. So she was flying mail to sort of remote places. And I felt like it was also, if you talk about most characters' journeys, that it's sort of a journey of actualization, right? That's what they're moving towards. And here was this woman who, this footage is, I don't know, there's something wonderful about it, her excitement and her sort of pioneering. And I felt like that somehow, I wanted to relate that at least to the lead character and her sort of, journey towards actualization, which is certainly not achieved in this film, will be somewhere down the line. But, that I wanted to make a connection, between those two things. So Kay Stinson was the name of the pilot, and then the footage of the clouds was something else, which I got from the National Archives, since you can use that legally and not pay a very expensive licensing fee. So.
Good. From Eon, which scene was the most challenging to shoot?
That's a good question. Well, I'll say two. Because the less interesting answer is the plane scene, just because of all the logistics that were involved in it, and we got up there and the light was really harsh, and there were lots of things about controlling the light and just being exhausted getting up there. But I would say beyond that, the scene where they're on the cliff and this is the emotional scene, and they're deciding, what to do about it, or arguing ultimately about what to do about it. And that was, just any scene. So what was great is they were all really committed to this, and they were all really, leading up to the scene in not great places, because they were putting themselves where their character was, whether it was anger or whether it was sadness and so on. But then at the same time, with this limited time and limited film stock, you are trying to sort of navigate all of these emotions, making sure that you get it, making sure that, this being sort of a hinge of the film and a crucial moment in the film, making sure that it comes off. So I think, in terms of sort of story and emotion, that was probably the trickiest part. But they were both, nerve-wracking or difficult in their own ways there.
And I have one from Anonymous. Really enjoy the way you captured the outdoors in this film. Were there any lessons you learned from the producing process of Blue? I'm sorry, were there any lessons you learned from the producing process of Blue Hole, or things you wish you had done differently?
Yeah, I think lessons. So I served as my own location scout for this, and I think that was. That's something you can hire people. I didn't have the budget for that, but it was also something that I enjoyed doing, and so I think that is maybe sort of a lesson that filmmakers or someone could take away, is that I think being intimately involved in that part of the process. Sometimes I think filmmakers just let location scouts and their producers take that away. That I felt the locations sort of shaped shaped the movie in a lot of ways to some degree. And the choices there, especially since the outdoors or just their environment is a really important character. Like, I was really glad that I had. Those were my choices ultimately, that I had this sort of direct line to the process. In terms of things that I wish I had changed, and I'm not saying this in any sort of self-satisfied way, but I think, a lot of times films don't come off like this, but I think, I think I didn't anticipate some of the challenges of just even basic locations, of loading into them. And this is just, again, maybe less interesting, but sort of the nuts and bolts of filmmaking. I don't know if I appreciated that. And so I think, it would have been my producers came on later in the process, and this was all happening, leading up to the film. So it would have been helpful to be location scouting at least some of the locations with my producers, months in advance. So they could have perhaps given me some pointers on that, or they could have lended a fresh set of eyes so that we didn't have some of the difficulties, which ultimately didn't derail anything, but were perhaps made our lives more difficult if that we didn't have those difficulties if the producers had been involved earlier in the process.
Okay, I think you've answered most of everything except for one question. Jim wants to know, was that pot they were smoking? Also, who was the flyer at the end?
Okay, so that was not pot that they were smoking. It was I forget. So if you Google it, if you Google fake pot for filmmaking, something like that, you can. That is a product that is out there. So no, it would have whatever the actor's own desires for that, and in shooting the scene. They wouldn't have helped any of the filmmaking if they had smoked pot. So I was clear on them not smoking pot there. But yeah, it looks pretty realistic, I guess. And answer the final pilot. I think the question was who's the woman at the end? It's Kay Stinson, mail deliverer in the I think 40s, something like that there. So in the 1940s. But no, it was not. I had students who viewed this film outside of, just gone to Vimeo and Googled me or whatever and come to ask me the same question. The answer is no, it's not pot. So.
Neel, thanks again. You've just been so generous with your time tonight. This has been a great conversation about a great film. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to my audience for being here. I hope you've enjoyed our faculty film series. Again, Ramapo professor Neel Scott with his showing of Blue Hole. I want to encourage you, if you're interested, we have a lot of other great free events coming up on our YouTube channel. Please go to our website and check out all the events. And if you're interested in getting on our mailing list, you can do that on our website as well. That's at www.ramapo.edu/Berry Center. Thanks, everybody, and have a good evening. Good night.
Thank you.